Let me just begin by a formal acknowledgement. So, Pekana Ian Anderson Palawa Troana, Pamarana Trawalawe Palmarana, University of Melbourne, Katumanta Mina Yoriora, Kanamina Nena Nikalanena. So, I began by acknowledging country in Palawakani, which is the traditional language of my mum's people. So, I work at the University of Melbourne. My job is there. I'm the Professor for Indigenous Higher Education. I'm also an Assistant Vice-Chancellor with a brief that includes Indigenous strategy, but also over the next 12 months we'll start to include work on community partnerships and regional partnerships such as here in the Goulburn Valley. So my task is to introduce the panel which will focus on outlining our collective thoughts on a shared vision for post-secondary education in the region. And I think Peter put the challenge there in one slide really plainly. The future economic prosperity of this region means we've got to tackle the rate limiting step, which is opportunities for young people to go into post-secondary education either through the vet sector or into higher education, because that's your workforce for the future and your future economic prosperity. So what underpins the presentations is a commitment to a regional post-secondary education system which provides a wide choice of relevant education options that have genuine pathways to meaningful employment, suit the talents of the individual and deliver the skills and knowledge for local industry and business to compete nationally and internationally. So our shared commitment to post-secondary education seeks to capitalise on the distinct educational model and mission of each institution. We're not trying to do the same thing. We actually think that the difference in what we do is a virtue here, and what we're trying to do is harness those differences in a way that builds the sum of the parts, and the sum of the parts having much more value than just us working in isolation and independently. So we represent quite different, distinct organisations. So from Goulburn Ovens Institute of TAFE, which is the largest tertiary educational provider in the Hume region, delivering in excess of 6 million student contact hours each year across 38 industry subsectors to more than 20,000 students, to La Trobe University and the University of Melbourne, which together are the largest providers of higher education places for students in the region. La Trobe has a vision for establishing a reputation for excellence and innovation in relation to the big issues of our time, and we've heard about many of those big issues right here today, and to make a difference, and is also the largest provider of higher education in regional Victoria. And the University of Melbourne, which is a research-intensive university with a very distinct curriculum model, which provides a broad undergraduate experience as a precursor to graduate and professional education. So many of us in the room have benefited from the transformative experience of post-secondary education. You know, I spent most of my childhood and teenage years in central Victoria, and as the son of an agricultural labourer, an Aboriginal mum, a university education was, for most people in my world, quite a distant and remote possibility. And yet the transformation that it's had in my life and the lives of my brothers and sisters has been something we couldn't have imagined as kids when we were living up on farms in various parts of regional Australia, including around here. However, I think that we can think about universities and post-secondary education and TAFE colleges doing more than just individual transformation and just kind of personal benefit, but something that contributes to the regional economy. And in fact, post-secondary education is a significant driver of regional economic, social and cultural development. So collectively we provide the human capital, the knowledge base and the innovation that are critical drivers for change. To that end, we also want to bring into the mix not just what we do with students but also research. And our research strategy is critically important to what we'll be looking to do in the next few years to identify ways in which our expertise can be aligned with the key issues that need to be addressed in order to support local innovation, local business development and local industry development. So post-secondary education can make a significant difference, but the key here, and this is the critical key, is to line up our educational delivery of industry-focused vocational training, higher education programs and research to a strategy that has a line of sight. And identifying the line of sight that's really important here for regional development, for prosperity, for healthy communities and for a strong culture. So the presentations will cover different perspectives of different institutions and our early thoughts about how we're going to connect up some of the work that we do, and our early thoughts about what we might do in order to build our contribution here to the region. I'm going to introduce the speakers. I'm not going to go through the very long bios. I'm going to do some very brief bios, and they'll come up one after the other. I'll just do the introductions now, and then we'll keep our questions to the end. So John Dewar is the Vice Chancellor and President of La Trobe University, came to Australia about 16 years ago from Oxford, has held senior positions at Griffith and the University of Melbourne, where he is Provost and one of my bosses. Glyn Davis is Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Melbourne, a Professor in Political Science, worked significant work in government, returned to Griffith as its VC in 2002 to the University of Melbourne in 2005 and is my current boss. And Paul Colpin, who's not my boss, but a really good colleague, is the CEO of GoTAFE since 2008, long experience in the business sector with a specialist background in marketing. So in that order, we'll just hand over to the speakers. Thank you, John.
Welcome to our Shepparton campus. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I think this is the third such event sponsored by the Fairley Foundation. And congratulations, Andrew, on bringing together two Vice-Chancellors and a TAFE CEO. I think you might be the only person in Victoria capable of achieving such a feat. I'm going to ask you not to feel too bad about the fact that normally this room would be used to teach nursing students on a Friday morning. They're now being taught in a local hotel in order to make way for us. That gives a new spin to the meaning of flexible learning, I think. And it's a real pleasure to welcome so many distinguished people in the room. Again, testament to Andrew's extraordinary pulling power, but I think also testament to the really healthy future that faces Shepparton, given the quality of people in the room. And thank you very, very much for coming. I just want to do three things. I want to outline some of the challenges facing regional communities in building and sustaining their human capital. Shepparton is in many ways an exemplar of the sorts of challenges that regional communities all over the world face, so you're not alone. Secondly, I want to talk about the importance of post-secondary and higher education pathways in addressing some of those challenges, and I'll say a little bit specifically, as you might expect, about what we do here in Shepparton. And third, I want to put to you a specific proposal based on experience elsewhere that has been quite transformative in a very similar community to Shepparton's, and I'll come to that at the end. Let me just say, though, that although there are three of us co-presenting here, I don't think we've got yet a common vision for the future of education, post-secondary education in Shepparton, but I'm hoping that the three presentations you're about to hear will form the basis for the beginning of the development of such a thing. And I think this is really why this is potentially such a useful forum, is that it's got the three of us talking in a way that we wouldn't have talked before, and I think that's been really valuable. I think the three of us would probably share three aspirations for our role in helping Shepparton into the future. The first is the importance of the role we all play in building aspiration amongst school students to complete school. I think all the demographic data indicates just how important a priority that is. And I just want to quote briefly from Katrina's paper under the heading of Education on page 2, I think it is, section 3. Levels of educational attainment in school, further and higher education in Shepparton are relatively low compared with other Victorian regional cities and Australia on average. This is a leading cause of poorer socioeconomic outcomes from cradle to career and beyond, including poorer health and slightly shorter lifespans. And school disengagement rates are high in Shepparton. Now, I think all three of us would agree that a really important role we can play is in trying to turn that around. That's the first thing. The second goes back to what Ian was saying about the importance of creating meaningful and productive post-secondary educational pathways jointly developed across the sectors with the TAFE and the universities that actually address the future workforce needs of the region. And the third aspiration that I think we would share is that in working together to develop human capital in that way, that we also work to retain it in the regions, that we don't create great individuals who then go off and contribute elsewhere. We want to keep them here. So those, I think, are the three propositions that I would like to put as the sort of foundations for what I will certainly say and what I suspect my colleagues will say as well. They're free to disagree, of course. So I want to begin by just outlining some of the demographic challenges facing Shepparton, and as I've said, communities, regional communities like it around the world. The chart on the right, I think, presents quite starkly the demographic challenge we face. It's adapted from an OECD paper delivered at a recent RDV conference. And we see from that around 30% of young people will leave Shepparton between the ages of 17 and 20. And once they've left, by and large, they don't come back. And they leave to pursue educational opportunities and work opportunities elsewhere. And while there's a bit of a return in the mid to late 20s and to the right of the scale that you can't see in the mid 30s, there is no point in this life cycle in which that drop is replenished. And the problem here is that some of our existing interventions to try and address this problem actually end up making the matter worse. I hesitate to use an example from Bendigo, but if you'll just indulge me for a moment. When I took over as Vice-Chancellor at La Trobe University a couple of years ago, one of my first ports of call was the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. Very big financial institution, as you know, in Bendigo, and a very good friend and partner of the universities there. They offered a scholarship scheme that would see the best and brightest of students from the Bendigo region travel to Melbourne to go to university. And I said, well, it's a great university, of course, and there are many great universities in Melbourne. But I said, what's your objective in doing this? And they said, well, it's to help build the capacity and the human potential of regional Australia. And I said, well, you do realise that most of them won't come back. If your goal is to retain students in the regions, then keep them here. So I persuaded them to allocate the very significant scholarship money that they were putting into sending students to our capital cities, at least in part, to sending students to our Bendigo campus. And we have been knocked over in the rush. It's quite clear that regional students, given the right financial circumstances, would much rather stay and study locally. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and enough of them to start making a difference. But my point is that some of our existing interventions, taking students from regional communities, giving them a great education, actually can make the matter worse sometimes. So that's my first point. The second point I want to make is about the importance of regionally based higher education. Now, it probably won't come as any surprise to you for me to urge the importance of having regional higher education providers. La Trobe, as I think Ian mentioned in his introduction, is the largest provider of higher education in regional Victoria. 1 in every 4 of our students is a regional student, and 1 in every 4 of Victoria's regional higher education students is a La Trobe student. So we are very important to the regions, and the regions are very important to us. And it's a very proud tradition of the university, and one that we intend to continue. But it means that we know, more perhaps than most universities, just how important that regional presence is in building and retaining human capital in the regions. Because the simple truth is that graduates from our regional campuses are much more likely to stay and pursue their professional careers in the regions than those who come to Melbourne. So in the case of Shepparton, for example, 81% of our graduates, and we track where they go when they leave us, they go on to work in regional Victoria or in regional areas interstate, compared with 16% of the graduates from our Melbourne campus. Now, those statistics, of course, hide lots of quite complicated patterns. And I think it's probably worth breaking the students down into two categories. Firstly, there are those students who currently move away and who we risk losing altogether from the regions. And I think the first question is, can we hold on to more of them than we do at the moment? I think universities like La Trobe have an important role to play in making sure that we do what we can to offer a suite of degree programs that are sufficiently attractive to students to stay and study locally. But that's not the whole story. I do believe that there's an important role for things like scholarships to play in encouraging students to stay locally. But then there are students, a second category of students, who have no choice but to stay in the same in a regional location, and for whom the degrees we offer make all the difference. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. When I went to my first graduation in Mildura, we have a campus in Mildura. It's not a very big campus. We graduate about 100 students a year, and I'm delighted that we'll be graduating our 1,000th student from Mildura this year. What struck me was that almost all of the graduating students were female. Almost all of them are graduating with nursing degrees or teaching qualifications or accounting qualifications. When I asked them why they'd come to study with us in the degrees they were studying, all of them said, because if you weren't here, if you didn't offer us the opportunity to do a degree, the alternative for us would be being checkout chicks in Coles. In other words, for those students who have no choice but to be in a particular place, the opportunities we provide are life-changing. So, hidden behind those statistics, I think there are some complex dynamics that we need to understand better. But my main point is that by offering these opportunities in the regions, to regional students, we are much more likely to persuade them to stay and have their lives, their families, and their careers in regional Victoria. So I get quite passionate about this because it's not something that's often understood, as my Bendigo Bank story, I think, attests. It's also why, and Glyn might want to close his ears at this point, La Trobe, together with Charles Sturt University, is pursuing a proposal for a regionally based medical school. Because to be based on the Victorian side of the border in Bendigo, around the new hospital, but with some clinical sites in and around Shepparton. We believe that the best way of solving the shortage of rural doctors is to recruit, train and graduate students from a regional medical school that is focused on preparing students for regional practice. The evidence is that that is the best solution to solving that aspect of the medical workforce shortage. So it's part of the same philosophy, if you like. Very quickly, just go through some of the things that we do as a regional university having a physical presence in a regional community. The first is that we act as an advocate, a policy advocate for the interests of regional higher ed. Some of you might have heard recently of the Kemp Norton review of the demand-driven system. My advisors tell me, I haven't had the opportunity to check this myself, but my advisors tell me that the La Trobe submission to that review was the only submission that came from a metropolitan-based university that actually addressed the question of regional higher education. And the reason that's important is that of all the indicators to do with participation in higher education that haven't shifted in the last 3 or 4 years, it's regional participation. We've improved participation by Indigenous students, we've improved participation by low SES students. What we haven't done yet is improve participation by regional students. And it's really important that those policy issues get flagged as we did in our submission. We contribute to the local economy in various ways. 45% of our enrolments at this campus are from students beyond the Greater Shepparton area. We draw students in. Those are people living, working part-time in Shepparton who would not otherwise be here. We have a graduate diploma of middle years education that is offered in blended mode, draws students from literally all over the country. We have students coming here from Sydney to study, in Shepparton to become teachers. We employ 20 staff, we have over 500 students here. We contribute to human capital formation. We have a rural health school that teaches all health disciplines except medicine. 80% of those graduates go on to work in regional Victorian health positions. We teach teachers. Most of the teachers in local schools will be La Trobe graduates. We're introducing this year a regional MBA, which I'm told is the only face-to-face delivered MBA between Melbourne's Northern Ring Road and Canberra. 75% of our Shepparton graduates work in regional Victoria. We're working closely with Paul and Michael and colleagues at GoTAFE to ensure that we develop suites of post-secondary educational pathways that are as integrated as possible. We support cultural activities in the city, for example, through the Shepparton Festival and the public lecture series, the Fairley Lectures and the Furphy Orations. We engage in outreach to schools and to Indigenous communities to promote participation, and we work with educational partners such as Goulburn Valley Health. And one thing that isn't on this slide, and which Ian has mentioned in his introduction, is the important research we do. And the idea is what I'm calling the Shepparton Promise, a promise that we make to all the young people of Shepparton. If you complete school and enrol in a higher education programme or a vocational programme with a pathway into higher education, such as nursing, within the Greater Shepparton region, you are guaranteed a scholarship that would cover your costs. This idea comes from Kalamazoo in Michigan, where they introduced something called the Kalamazoo Promise. And just very quickly, essentially, students from the Kalamazoo public system who go on to enrol in a Michigan institution of higher education have up to 100% of their costs covered. It has had extraordinary impact. Kalamazoo is a community very similar to Shepparton, similar population, regional, and so on, but the effect of this promise has been transformative on school completion rates, on school engagement. It's drawing families into the region. It's building participation in higher education, and to the extent that other states around America are now investigating the same initiative, including the state of Oregon, which is looking at spending $350 million a year on such an initiative. So powerful is the potential impact. We have modelled, and I'm happy to discuss this, we've modelled the cost, which sits comfortably within the $5 million a year that's currently being spent in Shepparton by those assembled in the room. And I'll leave it there. Happy to talk about it later on.